And the New York Empire are champions of the AUDL again.
For Charlie Hoppus and Anthony Nunez to get to the mountaintop, no one can ever take it away from you.
You know, we had a lot to prove. We lost last year, and that left a bitter taste in our mouth for sure.
Obviously, there are a lot of really talented teams in the division. We've believed that we are as good as we think we are.
It's easy to maintain culture when you're winning. That's the reality. I'm really confident in the group that we have.
I feel like we've just kept getting better and better and better.
Grinding, hustling, practice. Day one until they take us off the field.
We are sticking to the script of those 39 players and 2 coaches in the huddle are what matters and wherever people think we stand. So let's play the games and figure that out.
Floater, McDonald blocks it away from Oscar. Enormous layout block. Into the end zone. It is caught. Kyle Henke came back. Oh, goodness.
He went up, and then he just kept on going up.
And it comes down to the hands of Ben Young. You almost can't believe the story.
2023 season is here. We've got a preview episode of opening weekend. It is Swing Pass. I'm Adam. That is Daniel. We're going to launch right into some matchup previews as games get going tomorrow night. Today is Thursday, April 27th. Tomorrow, Friday, April 28th, is the start of the 2023 AUDL season. I can't be more excited. Daniel, I know you feel the same way, so again, let's just launch right into it. We're going to start with the premier game of the week for this season, the DC Breeze at Carolina Flyers, a battle between 2 of the league's super teams, 2 championship contenders right out of the gate. Daniel, what's it going to take for this DC team that has added so much talent to an already amazing roster this offseason? What's it going to take for them to win this game on the road against a very, very good Carolina squad?
Yeah, so it feels like DC is probably going to be regarded as the favorites coming into this game. I think people hear about all their offseason additions and they kind of like put that together as like DC having a very high ceiling for this season and very probably having the best shot of any team at competing with New York and potentially taking the East Division for themselves. But Carolina, like, I just think they're so practiced and so consistent with the chemistry that has been building in that team for years. So the key for DC is just like how quickly all of their offseason pieces can integrate into the offense in particular. So I'm thinking of guys like Thomas Edmonds, Andrew Roy, you know, if Cole Jurek or Joe Merrill play on offense too, those guys, like, it kind of has to feel right out of the gate like everything is normal and like going according to plan for DC. Like we've seen from their offense the past few years, they operate with like a very seamless amount of chemistry. They have a lot of fluidity between positions, handlers, and cutters. So if these new guys can come in and DC just like looks like how they've looked the past 2 years, I think they're going to be fine. The worry is like, can they hit that immediate chemistry this early in the season? That obviously remains to be seen. And I think that's going to be what it comes down to for DC, particularly on the offensive side.
Yeah, I think DC have a ton of momentum rolling off of the offseason. You can see it in their practices posted on social media. There's just a lot of fire. They seem to have a lot of togetherness that's existed there already with that core. And now they just kind of add in even more star talent. It just feels like we're only beginning to see the true ceiling for this Breeze squad. And yet, I absolutely agree with you. I think that they have to hit the ground running because this Flyers team right now is a perennial championship contender, no matter kind of what construction their given week's lineup is. I think that one of the prevailing strengths of this Flyers franchise, the past 2 seasons in particular, has been their adaptability. And, you know, you look at some of the absences that they have of inactivity this week, they're going to be missing Matt Guccio-Hannes, the backfield partner with Saul Yannick, comprising maybe the best backfield tandem in the league. Eric Taylor is going to be missing an indefinite amount of time as he works back from an injury. Liam Searles-Bose signed on this season, a huge playmaker who can play on either side of the disc. He will not make his 2023 Flyers debut this weekend. And yet, you've just got so much talent still on this Carolina roster, right? I mean, they posted a graphic to the league social media account yesterday detailing the potential starting 7 offense for the Flyers, and you're talking about Saul Yannick, Terrence Mitchell, Jacob Fairfax, Anders Jungs, Alex Davis, the additions of Ben Snell, who has played for this team in the past, but now comes back in his prime, kind of a top-tier player that I think people might not remember for how good he can be in this league, right? He didn't play at all in 2022. He only played, I think, 2 games for Seattle in 2021. But in those games, he averaged nearly 500 yards of total offense and like several.
Looked really good.
Will step into the Flyers system and know what to do immediately. And then to my point of, I think, what might be the true X factor accelerator in propelling this Flyers team to a win on opening weekend is the addition of Joe White. You got a bunch of great responses in your player chatter article on the AUDL.com this week talking about Mr. White. He is probably one of the more mercurial stars in the sport. When he's on, when he's white hot, there are maybe 5 players capable of kind of reaching his absolute zenith of abilities and skill. I mean, he's 6'3". He can make any play as a receiver. He has all the athleticism in the world. There were a couple times last championship weekend when he got on a sprint in the open field, and that dude can just fly, right? And that's just kind of his skill set as an athlete. He might be an even better thrower when he gets into rhythm. When that guy can wind up and deliver with that kind of frame and size and his ability to just sort of dictate matchups and put them back on their heels with that aforementioned athleticism, I mean, he's a total package. And yet, as we kind of always talk about with him, there is this aspect of the downside and the turnovers. And you did see that at championship weekend last fall as well, where he committed a couple of very key turnovers in the first half of that championship game. This Flyers team has been successful these past 2 seasons because of their adaptability, like I mentioned before, but also because they've been one of the best teams at not turning the disc over. They have some of the best turnover margins in the AUDL. Joe White is going to complicate that, I think, a little bit, but I also believe that he's going to kind of reform to the system. I think that he's been, on that Chicago team, they were a team of shooters and chuckers, as Pavlianis like to say, and nobody adapts to that mindset better than Joe White, I think. I think that changes here in the Flyers system, and I think that changes especially in a matchup like this against a DC team who is not going to yield you a bunch of turnovers. And so I think that we're going to see the good Joe White this weekend, and I think that might really put a disruptive notion into what we're thinking early season with this Breeze team, right? Like, there's so much hype. We do think of them as kind of being eye to eye with New York in terms of their talent. And yet here's the Flyers, who just have sort of been sitting off to the side while all this other offseason hype goes on. And I think very much licking their chops at some of these big matchups that they get throughout their 2023 schedule.
Yeah, for sure. No, I totally agree. I can see the Flyers either living or dying by Joe White this weekend. I think what's most interesting to me is just like how much of a green light he's given and then how much he plays on offense too. Because honestly, like that Alan Laviolette shooter role that they had Laviolette in 2021, like that was a huge part of their offense, and he only completed like 90-ish% of his throws. So like there is kind of a role there in the Flyers offense for someone to be a little bit more aggressive, but I just don't know if they're going to like fully commit to unleashing Joe White, or if they might have to because Eric Taylor's out this game and some other key absences. So it'll be worth following for sure.
It should also be noted that they might open up their lines even more. Like you were saying, we might see Joe White.
Right.
We might see half of this offense take turns on rotational D-line deployment throughout this game, and kind of both teams figuring out where the matchups are. It's going to be interesting to see where Rowan matches up on defense for the Breeze. If he's going to take a Joe White, if we get a White versus Rowan, that.
Oh, that'd be fun.
There's a lot of good individual matchup potential heading into this opening weekend, and maybe we can get into it with the second matchup that we want to talk about. Actually, the first game of the whole season tomorrow night, premiere Seattle at Salt Lake on watch.audl.tv. It starts at 10 p.m. Eastern live. I'm going to be just hyped wearing like one of those kind of like beer koozie helmets, but no beer, but like Diet Dr. Pepper just flowing in. I'm going to be in the zone for that one because the Shred had some of the best home games. Last year's season debut in Salt Lake was just bananas, like a highlight factory. It started with the Garrett Martin huge layout, have christened the whole experience of the Shred, and then it just kind of continued for 4 quarters. Garrett Martin is no longer on the Shred. He's now on Seattle.
Switch sides.
Joins Khalif El-Salam in kind of a return to the Cascades, a little bit of bolstering to their roster. But Cascades, again, entering with a good deal of questions about where they're going to stack up in the standings. On the other side, you have the Salt Lake team coming off of a West Division championship appearance in their first season. They lose Joe Merrill, who is such like a heart and playmaker for the Shred organization. But then they add in Grant Lindsley, Elijah Jaime, and some other great offseason additions. And it feels like this Shred team, for how they want to play this game, for me, what they need to do is just speed test Seattle. You know, I think that Seattle has some good top-end talent. I expect Seattle in one-on-one matchups with like Khalif and Garrett, et cetera, to maybe win here and there. But the problem that this Shred offense can present to Seattle when they roll out Jordan Kerr, Elijah Jaime, Grant Lindsley, and then the return of teen phenom Will Selfridge, that's
a tall order.
A lot of speed to deal with. And I don't know if the Cascades have the personnel to contain that. And I worry a little bit that we might see a repeat of what happened last year in this meeting where the Shred put up 32 at home, right?
Yeah, man, it's tough because I think Seattle, like when Seattle is at their best, they're playing a very fast, fast break style, both off of turnovers, but also the offense too. And I feel like them and the Shred have such similar play styles. I just think generally Salt Lake does it a lot better, a lot more consistently than Seattle does. So I do think Seattle, if they are going to keep themselves in this game, they're gonna have to kind of match and take advantage of any like additional early game mistakes that Salt Lake has. Like they do have some new pieces to work into their offense, so maybe Salt Lake has like a bit of a curve throughout the game and just like hitting their full potential. So if Seattle can like load up a D-line and just have Garrett Martin and Khalif just launching the disc to each other off turnovers, I think that's going to be great. But really overall, they just need to be consistent. They need to be in rhythm, and it's a lot easier said than done against a Shred team that also just creates a lot of defensive pressure too. Although they did have a good amount of defensive losses this offseason, so it kind of remains to be seen if they're going to have the same takeaway potential. But I don't know. It feels like kind of a team-wide energy, at least it did last year, that the Shred had defensively. So it's a tough ask for Seattle. Obviously, last year's Shred home opener did not go Seattle's way, but we'll see what happens this year. Still excited. I think these are two fun teams to watch.
I think to your point, Seattle needs to start fast. And we'll kind of talk about another team later in this set of previews who maybe wants to do a little bit different approach. But I think what really did the Cascades in last year was that Salt Lake crowd got into it from the start. And they just got to party for 4 quarters. And I feel like Cascades need to kind of get like a 2 to 3 goal lead early and just try to suppress some of that firework factory energy that gets going when these Shred dudes just start laying out at the disc. Like you say, they lose Joel Clutton, they lose Dusty Green, they lose some really talented D-line starters from last year, and yet they still return Chad Jorgensen, who made the all-defense squad last year, Porter Euler, who is a big boy in coverage, and just to your point, like a mob squad of other dudes who are just primed athletes ready to make themselves known on this stage. Ben Ashton, a number of times last year, made terrific plays in the game, on the disc, particularly in the Portland Nitro game, the week 11 game of the week. Kyle Weinberg led the team in takeaways last year. We don't talk about him nearly enough, I think. I think he's a very good defender, very talented in one-on-one space. Yeah, I think that the Shreds still have a lot to offer, and I think that if Seattle doesn't come with that energy immediately, it's going to be a little bit of a T-ball scenario. Like like it was last year in this exact same meeting.
Right. Ugh, it's so tough because they get such a nice home crowd too, and like an energized stadium, and like those are guys that
they get the shredheads.
But it's like the way they play too, just like it's a constant feedback loop.
There's a combo meter
of energy.
Yeah, there's a combo meter, and they kind of like hit little
right
like special moves at times. It feels like, and all of a sudden the fast breaks turn into like 4 in a row, and it's just Jorgensen boosting it to like a Hoffman brother or one of his own siblings, because now there's 3 Jorgensens on this roster.
3 Jorgensens this year. That is worth mentioning. I don't know.
The Norbombs. They're almost going to surpass the the Norbombs are 2.
Right. Are all the Jorgensens active for tomorrow? I got to look right now.
Yet. I think that would almost make it. I think DC might have had 3 Bergerons active for a game one time. Otherwise, I think it would tie most siblings active on a single roster. But I would need to be
active. Chad is actually the one that is out. McKay and Luke are playing.
No, I've heard good
things. Hey, no Chad Jorgensen. That kind of changes things. I was just going
to say I was looking forward to the Chad versus Khalif matchup. Just beast versus beast.
Yeah, those are athletes.
I wanted to see those 2 dogs go out and run for it in space. Like Jorgensen had some of the most sensational blocks from last year, and everyone knows the plays Khalif is capable of making.
Yeah. Well, it'll have to wait till their next meeting, unfortunately.
Well, we're going to shift back to Saturday night game, talking about one of the interdivisional matchups from this weekend. Indianapolis at Atlanta, actually a rematch of a final weekend of the regular season game from last year that Atlanta persevered at home at. I forget the final score. It was like 25-23, something like that.
Yeah, it was a 2-goal game, I know.
Big fast break game. Lots of hucking and running out into space. Both teams kind of finding a rhythm and just sort of running with it. Atlanta could not throw their zone against that consistent swing-heavy Indy offensive attack, so they had to resort to a lot of man-on-man, which, as it usually does, leads to a lot of goals for Indianapolis's Cameron Brock. I expect Atlanta to have a little bit different of an approach this year. They're also going to have some increased defensive pressure from courtesy of Jakeem Polk, who will be returning from injury and making his 2023 debut after missing all of last season. We might get to see some Jakeem versus Cam matchups, which I think would be pretty good for the viewing audience. But as far as what Atlanta needs to do at home to kind of, I think, hold serve in a game that they're favored in, they got to live by the long ball. I think that Atlanta showed that the best version of themselves is when they just continue to pressure teams over the top. No team completed hucks at a higher percentage last year. They were still 4th in volume as a deep throwing team. And when you have Austin, Draco, Taylor, and Bobby Lay as your initiating pieces, you just have so much to work with. And I really think that their ability to get into more of a rhythm with Matt Smith and Max Thorne, who only made 8 and 5 starts last year, respectively, this Atlanta team, it feels like we saw their potential in bits and pieces last year. I feel like we're going to see the fully formed version from almost the get-go this year. They've been practicing a lot more as an entire team this year. Last year was plagued a little bit by smaller pod workouts and practices. It seems like there's a lot more team energy this year. Tuba Benson Jaja, the head coach, has this team on a line, according to a lot of reports coming out from their training camps. I like the hustle. For as good as I think Indy is going to challenge them in this game, it's just one of those things where I think the hustle can present a fairly simple strategic front, and that will lead to success for them. I don't think that they need to do any kind of crazy adjustments or game plan in a specific way. I think they kind of need to come out and attack in the way that the hustle like to attack. And that's going over the top. And, you know, the AlleyCats, for as kind of bend not break sturdy as their defense can be, they have some trouble in limiting opponents throwing hucks. And you could see that in the game last year where JP Burns had an insane game on defense. I think he was something like 6-6 on hucks. It kind of like launched his all-star candidacy. Indy can't let that happen again. And to Atlanta's point, like, make that happen all the time. Like, give multiple throwers a green light. Trust your athletes out in space and know that they can go make plays against this Indy defense.
Yeah, it's going to be tough on Indy because, right, they just generally don't have the defensive personnel that, like, contrasted to Salt Lake. Like, they don't have this kind of top to bottom roster mentality of, like, taking the disc away, throwing their bodies around. They have some guys that will do it and that will challenge their matchups for sure. But it's definitely more of a...
Nick Hutton loves to throw his body
Nick
around.
Hutton's a great example. Yeah, I think Xavier Payne, we've seen it from too. Jake Fella is a great defender. So, like, they have some guys, obviously, but I think what made them such a great D-line last year was obviously their conversion rate, and it was just taking advantage of every single opportunity that came their way. I forget what their final percentage was, but I know that it was just behind New York.
66.
New York's offense. We should check that.
6% conversion rate.
Something like that.
It's the second highest rate ever for any line.
For any line, yeah.
Silly. They were more efficient.
It is silly.
Than any offense ever, but New York's own record-setting offense.
Right. And I think we've both kind of assumed they have to regress to some extent this season, right? Like, there's no way they can keep that up for an entire second season in a row. But the key to this game for them, I think, is just going to be taking advantage of those mistakes. Because if Atlanta is just, riding their deep balls like they like to, riding their deep balls, forget I said that. I just think Indy is not going to have a ton of opportunities, but the opportunities they do have are probably going to come from miscues of Atlanta firing deep. And if Indy can, make good use of their timeout calls, make sure Xavier Payne is really leading those counterattack drives effectively, that's going to keep them in this game. And I think offensively too, like, Indy just needs to be as consistent as possible. I think the fact that Atlanta likes to throw out different defensive looks and Indy responded so well to them last year, like, that bodes well for their chances from an offensive standpoint too. But yeah, if you have to key in on one thing, it's going to be those defensive break conversions because, yeah, I just don't see them forcing a lot of turnovers naturally.
We've talked a lot about how interdivisional losses can kind of actually be like a 1.5x loss, right? Like, they matter a little bit more. You can't afford that kind of loss, especially in a tight divisional playoff race, which Indy is going to be in the thick of in the Central.
Yes.
However, I think even if they lose this game, this is going to be a terrific primer for the rest of the AlleyCats schedule working into their Central Division slate. Like, I think that them getting this matchup, as opposed to Pittsburgh and Madison will be playing this weekend, I think that it'll actually be more beneficial for the AlleyCats to get a rep against a team as good as Atlanta and to kind of get to test themselves at this level right away. Because
I like it too.
I was pleasantly surprised by how well they competed at the end of the season last year against Atlanta. And it felt very odd that Atlanta was kind of holding a wire-to-wire win against a team that was advancing to the playoffs while the Hustle themselves didn't. But it reminded me that, like, Indy belongs in these conversations. And I think that while Indy doesn't maybe have the greatest resume of wins against playoff teams in recent years, they still hang around and they still execute at a level that earns the respect of these teams. Coming out of this matchup last year, we talk about Atlanta not being able to throw their zone against them. And also Jake Specs Fella, his defense against Draco was noted throughout the scouting report after that game. I mean, Hustle players, including Draco himself, were like, that's the best I've been guarded all season. So there are aspects that this Indy team can do to complicate Atlanta. I just think that there's way too many options for Atlanta to work through. Like, they're one of those teams that I think, because, we just did our player rankings, top 25 players in the AUDL. One Atlanta player made the top 25 overall players, but I feel like just beyond that kind of top 25 threshold, there's
the next 10 spots or something
coming up into that range, right?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think if Specs is able to limit Austin Taylor, like you said, I think Atlanta has enough other options where they're not going to they're never going to totally abandon their deep game. I've also heard rumors, Matt Smith on the Hustle Instagram story the other day, he was talking about how they might have some new bigs coming over to the O-line. And it wasn't just a Freystetter reference, who, by the way, will not be active this first week, but I think there's some potential for Atlanta to play with like Holzmeyer and Dean Ramsey as deep receiving threats.
Long-time team veteran Trenton Spinks. That dude is gigantic.
Yeah.
And sometimes like using him a little bit in throw and go sets. So I would love to see something like that. And look, I'm always of the opinion that you could put Jakeem Polk for a couple of offensive reps and just let him go get.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Let's move on to the East Division. Philadelphia Phoenix at New York Empire on Saturday night. Defending champions having their home opener to start the season against a Philly team that is very much set on trying to make themselves a part of the contending pack at the top of the East Division. This is a perfect opportunity for a statement game for the Phoenix, and they played really well in their matchup at New York last season, early in the season as well. It was a rainy, cold game, tight margins, and Philadelphia kind of flourished in that sort of environment. It slowed down the New York offensive attack just enough, I think, to give Philly an additional edge that they needed, obviously, and ultimately the Empire prevailed in the end. And then in their most recent matchup from last season, New York just kind of went wire to wire with the win. Paul Owens played terrific defense on Jack Williams in that game. That was kind of the only good defense that was being played against the Empire. Ryan Osgar basically had his best performance of his MVP season, went 33 of 33 on throws, had 8 assists, almost 400.
He had 10 assists.
10 assists,
2 goals.
like almost 500 throwing yards. John Lithium and Babbitt were going off. They threw their. It was close around halftime, I remember, and the first set out of halftime was like an 11-second drive where they just got the first initiating pass to Osgar and under, and he just uncorked a perfect flick to the back corner to Ben Yacht, and that was kind of like...
Oh, right. Because, they switched Yacht over just for like a random O point. And man, I just... It's such a tall order to contain really any one player on the New York offense, but it just goes to show, and Jack Williams was the star of that first game they played last year, because of course he's the one that shines blocks. In these 3 blocks. I think he had 6 total scores. He shines in these terrible condition games because he's just the best player out there, and he can show it. But Paul Owens was inactive for that first game, so then Owens comes in active for the second game, does a really good job against Jack Williams, but then it's just the Ryan Osgar show. And good for New York, having that flexibility. And we saw it into the playoffs too. All of a sudden teams are starting to back Osgar front Osgar and force him into the deep space as more of a cutter. And then Jack Williams just takes over in the underneath space and as a handler. So the flexibility that New York has, particularly in those 2 guys, Jack Williams and Ryan Osgar, that's going to be the key for Philly. If they can figure out what other teams did down the stretch, teams like DC, Carolina, Chicago in the championship, and really limit the throwing ability of Ryan Osgar, and then you have Paul Owens somehow shutting down the Jack Williams matchup, which I'm still not so sure he could do in a vacuum. But I it's just those 2 guys. If he can really gum up what they're trying to do, then the offense, I think, could have issues, the New York offense. But I just don't know if Philly has the defensive personnel to accomplish that.
I hear what you're saying. I actually worry about the other players in Philly's kind of rotation. I think that they struggled a little bit more with the bigs. Lithium and Babbitt lit them.
Yeah, I mean they're bullies, but someone has to get them the discs is the thing, and typically that was either Jack or Oscar.
This is one of those matchups too, where sure they might have the first and second solutions available. Maybe Philly does figure out something to quiet Oscar a little bit, but then you still have Chartok, who had a very good game. Elliot Chartok, excuse me. There's 2 Chartoks now, and speaking at siblings. Elliot Chartok was also terrific in both matchups against Philly last year. And Solomon Bailey is right now the most efficient passer this league has ever seen. He simply does not turn the disc over. I think he's got something like 7 turns in almost 1,000 career touches.
Something like that.
It's one of those things where I feel like New York in this particular matchup, they're comfortable saying, hey, you took Jack off the table. That's fine, man. We're still going to put up 25, right? And to that point, I worry a little bit about Philly getting over-reliant on Hucks in this game, trying to really punch with New York. I think that New York's defense could give them a lot of fits early in the season, especially if there's a little bit of weather. And for New York, I think, again, it just kind of comes down to like show of force. Just be who you are, kind of continue with the same mojo that you finished last season with, which is sort of these teams can't stay on the field with us. They can't go 3 lines deep as we can. And I think that similar to kind of Atlanta's presentation with Indy, you don't need to really overcomplicate this, right? Like simple approach works in this situation. You're going to be at home. You're going to have the energy behind you. Presumably, there's going to be some kind of banner or championship presentation. Own that, like be the empire. Yeah. I think that this might be the year too, where like the individuals on this team are so likable. I feel like a couple years ago, you could kind of, say like, the Empire, like Ben Yacht, he's so big, he just kind of slams around and gets scores and stuff. But now like Ben Yacht has done so much to become, I think, a more likable person and a more outstanding teammate. And like Jack
they're
Williams,
still the bad guys. They're still the villains of the league.
They're not. That's what I'm saying.
They're the evil Empire.
But that's what I'm saying. I think this year they will have to adopt more of that mindset. Like I do think that them kind of being the aw shucks, like we win every game, but you still like us. Like I think that that's wearing thin a little bit. I think that they've got to kind of make a little bit of a heel turn, kind of own into, hey, we're just going to run out every opponent by 8 goals every game, right? I mean, they have it in them, right? Yeah. Like it's fully possible that they can do that. I would say the one other thing for New York that I was just thinking about, Philly obviously just like has their offense down to like exactly what they want to do in every game, and that is huck the disc early, often, as much as possible. I think what DC did a great job of in the East Division playoffs last year was not getting like so sucked into that type of game. Like DC was still so good at just methodically like playing their game, working it up. And so I think if New York can do the same thing, just like not get sucked into the style that Philly wants to turn the game into, then I think they'll be fine. Yeah, it's sort of the Madison Radicals' historical approach to games, which is simply like limiting the total number of possessions in a complete game to like 35, like 35 total scores, making it a game so it's like, 18-17 or something. These smaller margins against better teams typically work out better for underdogs. And I totally agree with you. When you go up tempo against a New York team, it's math then. They're going to score more than you. They do that.
Right.
That's what our stats tables tell us. So you got to take some of that raw scoring total, I think, off the table. And that's what I mean. If Philly gets pressured and they start wanting to push the huck game more, you can't do that against New York. They're the best.
But they're going to do it. They're doing it. That's who they are. That's who Philly is. No one's going to change that.
And at the same time, I would love to see Philly beat New York and complete 15 hucks in the process and just rain it over the top. Like, that would be terrific.
Right. I will say, hey, Jordan Ryan, he did not play against New York last year. He missed both games. He will be active. So that was, the best hucker in the league last year from, like, a completions per game standpoint.
If you were to come up with like a hucking passing stat between like volume and completion rating, because he was second overall in total huck completions, trailing only Jonathan Nethercutt, and then he was completing it at like a 75% clip or something.
76.7 was his completion rate.
I would put him and like Draco right around the same. Obviously, Ryan Osgar is up there too. He missed one huck attempt all of last year, so a lot of good deep throwers in this game. But to your point, Ryan missed both of the Empire matchups last year. He's going to make a huge difference for them on offense. I mean, other than Nethercutt, there's no one better in the league right now at those standstill hucks than Jordan Ryan. Like
they're dangerous.
They called him the natural, I think, for a little bit. Like he just has that. Like you watch him throw, and that's the way that you throw, right?
It's so smooth.
That game's on Saturday night. We've got one more game we want to preview. We're not going to get to every matchup in the week 1 slate, but we wanted to get to the the expansion Houston Havoc's first ever game at home on Saturday night, hosting the Austin Soul. Great interstate rivalry to get that organization going. Havoc have been very, very active all off season long. I think they started practicing before any other team this off season. They've just kind of had whole buy-in from day one, which is exactly what you want going into your very first game as a franchise. And for them to win, kitchen sink time, baby. You're just throwing everything, I think, if you're Houston. You're doing roller pulls from the get-go. You're doing trap setups. You're fudging the map every single time that Austin has a possession, right? You're never letting them get settled. And I think that you're just trying to find big plays that can ignite your energy, get that home crowd into it. It looks like Houston has a terrific venue. I expect them to have a loud crowd on hand too. Texas always does it big. And I've talked about it a few times before. I think they need to have that kind of Radicals mindset. This team reminds me a little bit of how the Radicals came into the 2013 season, which was a little underhyped, little question marks about this mix of both older veterans that would kind of aged out past their primes and a whole bunch of young people who hadn't really asserted themselves on the scene yet. I see a little bit of that in the Havoc team makeup. And I think that similarly, they need to apply pressure on defense. Now, the 2023 Austin Soul offense is warp eons beyond what the Windy City Wildfire were playing in 2013. Granted, that Chicago team had Brody Smith, Goose Helton, and some great players on it. Fundamentally different kind of sport being played, I feel like.
It's a different world.
Like there was something like 10 more turnovers a game for each team or something. It was just mud ball back then. So I think that Houston has a much larger challenge ahead of them on Saturday night, but I think they need to apply the same basic precepts, which is just disrupt, continue to throw lines of fresh legs at them, try to tire them out, and just, again, like throw everything. Just we talked about a little bit with Bex Force when we interviewed her a few weeks ago about how they've just been developing kind of situational awareness for any conceivable scenario. And I think that they really need to put that into practice. The problem is that they're facing a very good and talented team and also one of the best coach teams. You know, Austin does have the reigning coach of the year in Stephen Nagy. This is a team that kind of bootstrapped itself into some success in 2021 about out strategizing their opponents, running some great half-field sets. So this is going to be a big challenge to knock this Soul team off of their rhythm, but Houston's just got to try. They've got to, because they can't play this Austin team straight up, like in game. Right. It's too good of an opponent.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's kind of like Austin's key to winning this game is just to like play their game. Like don't get roped into whatever nonsense Houston's throwing at you. Like don't get frazzled by the home crowd, in a tough road environment. I just think Austin overall just has more talented players that have more AUDL experience. They are trending upward as a franchise. They can get away with not having to do too much to like really silence Houston, or like they don't have to make this game a blowout. They just have to stick to their guns, play their game, use Henke, Mark Evans, Evan Swiatek, Jake Radak, just like let those guys run the offense. I am curious to see what happens with that offense with no Paul Starkel there. So they kind of have a potential backfield vacancy, but assuming they've figured out these kinks in the offseason, I'm not too worried about Austin's chances in this one. I would be very surprised if Houston could pull off the upset. But at the same time, I get what you're saying. And like, if they can just kind of throw mayhem at Austin, that does seem like their best chance of winning.
And I know earlier, a couple matchups ago, we talked about Seattle and Salt Lake and how Seattle need to get off to a fast start there. I worry about that for Houston. I think that them getting out early will just activate the deeper competitor inside of the Soul, right? Like, I think that the most advantageous spot for the Havoc to be in this game is kind of neck and neck, and using some of that home crowd, that momentum, that kind of intangible energy at the end of the game, just like surge past. Right. I just think it's too much of an ask for an expansion team to be expected to hold a lead against the Soul offense this talented. And might I add, and we need to start talking about this more, for as much accolades as we give to the Soul offense, that defense is going to be
their defense is great.
Even without Jake Reinhardt, who was arguably their best defender last year, they have dudes who can run. They add Shaden Worthington and Duncan Fitzgerald, two terrific hustle players to a lineup that already has a ton of those. Like, as hard as it's going to be for the Houston the Houston defense to slow down Austin's offense, Austin's defense might get 15 to 20 blocks in this game if the Havoc aren't careful, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, they can really open things up, especially with like the way that they can attack after turnovers too, with guys like Joey Wiley and Matt Armour. Like, they're very well equipped to blow out a team like Houston or like Dallas that can't seem to find the offensive efficiency to keep pace. So yeah, I think there's definitely like blowout alert going into this game. But if I'm Austin, I'm not thinking about that. I'm playing my game, sticking to my guns, see what happens. It shouldn't be too much to ask for them to win this game.
Right. Well, that'll do it for this week 1 preview episode of Swing Pass. There are a couple other games happening this weekend. Seattle will play a second game following their Friday night matchup on Saturday in Oakland against the Spiders. There will also be another Central Division game. Madison is traveling to Pittsburgh to face the Thunderbirds. We mentioned that briefly. I believe that does it for week 1 action. There's only 7 games this weekend.
7 games.
Going forward, there's basically 10 plus games every other weekend throughout the regular season, going up through the end of July. We will be there with you the entire way. We cannot wait to start watching games tomorrow night. You can tune in live on watch.audl.tv. Thank you so much for tuning in here with us. We will see you again on Sunday night, if not Monday morning, for a recap of all the action that just was. We're hoping for some upsets. We're hoping for some big highlights. We're just hoping for that energy that only comes with the AUDL season. We'll see you soon. Bye.